This meeting is being recorded.
There we go. Okay, well, I think I'll get us started and just do some introductions while the last few people trickle in, and then we'll hand it over to Ken. So thanks for being here tonight, everybody. My name is Annie Carter. I am the program coordinator with Colorado Canyons Association. For those of you who aren't familiar with kind of the scope of our work, we do community education, outreach, and stewardship on the 3 national conservation areas here in Colorado. We're so lucky that all 3 of them are here in Western Colorado. We work very closely with the Bureau of Land Management. And so tonight we have Ken Holsinger joining us. He is an ecologist down at the Uncompahgre Field Office in Montrose. When I was brand new to Colorado, I had come out here to do an AmeriCorps Vista term with CCA, living in Montrose. Ken was kind enough to let me hop in his truck and ride around with him to go find and do some monitoring on a couple of the species that I expect he might talk about tonight. And so that was hugely educational for me, being new to this area and learning some of the local ecology. So Ken, thank you for speaking to us tonight, and I'll turn it over to you. One thing I wanted to add, sorry, is that we're gonna have questions at the end. So if anything comes up while Ken is speaking, feel free to throw that in the chat or the Q&A, and I will address that at the end when we do have time for questions.
Okay, well, good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Those that tried to join a few weeks ago, sincerely apologize. You can never plan when you're gonna get sick. So again, thanks for tuning in, and we'll go ahead and get started. So Annie, I'm assuming you can see my screen okay?
Yep, looks good.
Good. Okay, well, we'll jump right in. So we're going to talk tonight a little bit about rare plants that we find in the Dominguez-Escalante Gunnison Gorge and McInnes Canyons National Conservation Areas. We'll also talk about a couple of plants that occur in and around those areas that we strongly suspect may be there. I also want to discuss a little bit about how BLM manages these species to conserve them and ensure that they're going to be around for future generations. So those that aren't familiar, the McInnes Canyons National Conservation Area lies just west of Grand Junction. The Dominguez-Escalante National Conservation Area lies between Grand Junction and Delta. And then the Gunnison Gorge National Conservation Area lies to the east of Delta and north of the city of Montrose. So those are the general areas we'll be discussing things. And then also those surrounding BLM lands. A lot of the species that occur in the NCAs also occur on similar BLM habitats surrounding these areas. So what makes a rare plant? It starts with being endemic, which is a species that's only found in a defined physical or geographical place and not anywhere else in the world. And then because we're silly biologists, we also divide things even further. There are broad endemics, which are restricted to a specific region, and that area can be rather large, but are seldom rare. So a good example is the 2-needle pinyon trees that we see all around. They occur, you know, from the southern Rockies to the middle of the Colorado Plateau and from southern Idaho all the way to the Mexico border, but they're very much not rare. Rather, we're here to talk about tonight narrow endemic species, which are species that best fit the colloquial notion of being rare. They are species that are highly localized and are found in small numbers in only a few localities, and we'll see that tonight. Since we're talking about the Colorado Plateau where the NCAs lie, they lie on the eastern end of the Colorado Plateau. Pretty interesting fact is that the Colorado Plateau supports numerous species that are found nowhere else in the world, but by far the richest taxonomic group of such species is the plants. There are over 300 different endemic species known in the Colorado Plateau. So how do they get to be narrow endemics? Well, plants evolved to exploit niches that are shaped by geology. And in Colorado, we have a really complex geology. We have a lot of topographic relief that exposes that geology. And plants tend to evolve on specific geologic formations like the Morrison Formation. Yet other plants evolved to be even more specialized on a specific geologic member of a formation. Niches are also shaped by climate. So the 3 NCAs we're talking about tonight all occur in a semi-arid, cold, temperate climate. It's cold in the winters, hot and dry in the summers, and generally not a lot of precipitation overall. Then further, niches are shaped by vegetation. Species evolved to coexist with different plant communities like the pinyon juniper woodlands, the mixed salt desert scrubs, or salt desert grasslands. So generally, all these things come together to make, narrow endemic species that are highly restricted and generally highly specialized on a very specific environment. So because these species are rare, many of the species we'll talk about tonight, we, the BLM, manage as sensitive species. And our goal is to manage species that are designated as sensitive to preclude the need for protection under the Endangered Species Act. And that's where my role with BLM comes into play, working with a lot of these species we're going to discuss. So we'll jump right in and we'll start talking about what everybody wanted to talk about, all the cool different plants that occur. So the first one we'll talk about is Astragalus Raphaelensis, or the San Rafael milk vetch. It's in the pea family and is only known to occur in Colorado and Utah. We do find it in the Dominguez, Escalante, and McInnes Canyons NCAs, as well as in the canyons that fall away from the top of the Uncompahgre Plateau. What makes this plant so cool is that it's a selenium hyperaccumulator. In other words, it sequesters vast amounts of selenium, which protects the plant from herbivory and disease. Consequently, it's confined to soils with elevated selenium. As a highly drought adapted species, its leaflets are unusually absent, and most of the leaves are reduced to a tough, naked rachis. In other words, a kind of a sharp point. This species does co-occur with many common plants in the Colorado Plateau, like pinyon juniper, rabbitbrush, sagebrush, etc., as well as with other selenium specialist plants. This species prior to 2016 was actually recognized as 2 separate species, the Astragalus Nataratensis, as well as Astragalus Raphaelensis. And BLM funded some genetic research on these 2 species, and that work concluded that indeed they are not distinct, and so they were subsequently combined back into just Astragalus Raphaelensis. Graduate student we funded, his name is Statswick. So just here's a photo of this species. Unlike normal pea plants, you don't see those highly dissected leaflets. Rather, you get these long linear leaflets that really are unique to the pea family. And then again, going back to the work that was done to combine this species back into one, the blue dots here are showing plants that were identified prior to 2016 as Astragalus lineafolis, and then the orange dots were identified as Astragalus Raphaelensis. And now these, again, with these 2 species being combined back into one, well, we expanded the geographic range of the species. It's still highly restricted, as you can see, just a few small places in western Colorado and central Utah. Another cool species that occurs in the Dominguez Escalante National Conservation Area is Astragalus Nataratensis, or the Natarita milk vetch. This species is only known in Colorado, New Mexico, and Utah, generally the Four Corners region. We do suspect that it could occur in the McInnes Canyons NCA, but so much of it is wilderness, it's not easy to survey for. It's also very common along the Dolores River. It occurs on sandstone ledges, crevices of sandstone bedrock, dry rock mesas and ledges. It's commonly found in pinyon juniper woodlands with shallow soils, often with bedrock very close to the surface. We think what's going on there is it doesn't have a big taproot like other astragali. And so it's exploiting the fact that the limited moisture is staying close to the surface where its roots can access it. It's also considered an early seral species that colonizes disturbances in the right habitat. BLM had done a vegetation manipulation near Nucla in the 1970s, removing all the pinyon juniper again on these shallow rocky soils. And in 2015, we went out to monitor that vegetation treatment, and we discovered that we're dealing with the largest population of this species that we know of, that essentially its boundaries are where the trees were removed from the treatment area. This is a species I do a lot of monitoring on. Following the drought that occurred in 2012, the Fish and Wildlife Service contacted us and they were concerned about many populations of this species blinking out. So when we found this huge population near Nucla, and we established a long-term monitoring plot on it in 2015. And what we've really been able to find out in a pretty short period of time is that while being a short-lived perennial, this species is pretty drought tolerant, and its response mechanism to drought is to simply go dormant. So our data here kind of suggests that. So we saw substantial population declines leading up to the drought that occurred in 2018. But then in 2019, we had a phenomenal wet spring and relatively cool conditions. And all of a sudden, the plant population exploded. Most of these plants, if you look down here, were mature plants. They weren't new seedlings. And so we're left to conclude that one of its drought mechanisms is to simply lie dormant in the soil profile. Too fast. Another cool species we manage is the Lupinus crassus, or Payson lupin. This species only is known to occur in Colorado, and further, it's only known to occur in western Montrose County. We do believe it has the potential to occur in the Dominguez Escalante and McInnes Canyons National Conservation Area. The geology and soils are right. A little more work needs to be done. It occurs only in pinyon juniper woodlands, and a pretty cool thing is it's the only species of lupin that does occur in pinyon juniper woodlands. It exploits manka shell derived soils in and around the Natarita area and on the Chenli Formation in the Paradox Valley. Both these soil types are derived from shales. And it's commonly associated with weathered coal deposits that are near the surface. And further, it's commonly found in ephemeral drainages. So you can see it's fairly highly specialized plant. And they're just showing it's, pretty much localized to only western Montrose County. No other records of this species outside of the area. This is also a species that we conduct long-term monitoring on. We've had environmental groups inquire as to whether or not this species should be considered for protection under the Endangered Species Act, again, on the premise that population trends seem to be in decline. So in 2016, we found a large enough population that we could establish a long-term monitoring plot for it. And we've been monitoring ever since. And similar to the Natarita milkvetch, what we're finding is that what people perceive as declining trends is really drought response. This species is even more drought tolerant in that it goes dormant during hard drought. And our monitoring shows it even further. So if we look at this heat map down below, this shows basically we had lots of plants going into 2017, And then all of a sudden, a substantial drought landed in 2018, and we had no plants whatsoever. And again, in 2019, we had a pretty decent spring, and they've slowly been responding ever since. And so again, our monitoring is showing that some of these perceptions of population declines is maybe more attributable to environmental factors that are not well understood. And then the figure on the upper right shows that statistically, there has been no change in this population despite what we may have perceived in 2018. So the next two plants we're going to talk about, I actually need to do more work with, and I look forward to it. And thanks to some of the other species we're going to talk about later, I'm anticipating more work on these. So vicina, or uncompahgre bladder pod, is only known to occur in Montrose and Uray counties, occurs in the Dominguez, Escalante, and Gunnison Gorge NCAs as well. It only grows on Mancos Shale at the ecotune between pinyon juniper woodlands and salt desert scrub. And we've been finding some plants in sandy soils derived from sandstone in the sagebrush steppe and PJ woodlands on the Uncompahgre Plateau. It also is an early colonizer of disturbance. It's in the mustard family, and the whole family generally are early colonizers. Most of our invasive weeds around here are also mustard, so that gives you some idea of kind of how this species can behave. It's the only Phyceria in this area that has a white flower, so it's pretty distinguishable in that regard. And it's a fairly new species to science. It's was recognized as a distinct species in 1997. And like I said, we don't know much, and I look forward to doing more work. Some of the threatened and endangered plants have really been driving my workload over the last 12 to 14 years. Another one is Elimination consenum, or Adobe desert parsley. This species is also only known to occur in Colorado. Occurs in the Gunnison Gorge NCA only, and in the valley surrounding the towns of Delta and Montrose up to Paonia. It prefers adobe hills and plains on rocky soils. It's associated with the salt desert scrub communities, occasionally sagebrush and greasewood, and up at the upper elevations, we find it in scrub oak up near Paonia. A lot of work needs to be done on this. There's a lot of unknowns about this species, about recruitment, about drought resilience. And so we're getting geared up this spring to do establish a bunch of long-term monitoring plots. We're also planning to do a population estimate this spring in response to some proposed bike trails near Paonia. So again, only known to occur in Delta, Montrose, and Uray counties. So now we get to talk about some of the cool plants. I mean, what couldn't be cooler than orchids, columbines, and hanging gardens in the desert? So the first one we'll talk about is Epipactis gigantea, or the giant Heliborn. It's actually an orchid, and while it's found pretty widespread from British Columbia down to Texas, it's still considered a narrow endemic because it's only found in seeps and springs or permanent wetlands. The best populations are in Dominguez Escalante NCA. There are some records of it occurring in McInnes Canyons, and there are also nice examples of this species along the Dolores River where the sandstones contact more porous geologic formations. It must have permanent and constant water at the roots. It does have a wide tolerance of soil pH. And what's amazing is it occurs in Death Valley and in some of the high sulfur hot springs in Yellowstone National Park. Just a beautiful plant. Just showing you here kind of the location, the counties where we've been able to locate it in Colorado, concentrated here in Mesa, Delta, and Montrose counties, but also up in Moffat County. Another cool species that we deal with is the Aquilegia marcantha, or Mancos columbine. It's pretty narrow endemic, restricted to the Four Corners region in Northwest Colorado. It also is only found in seeps and hanging gardens, similar locations as the orchid. It also needs a permanent and constant source of water for its roots. And unlike other columbines, it can tolerate soils high in salts and selenium. And then lastly, Mtulus eastwoodii, or eastwood monkey flower, is found in Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, and Utah. It's endemic to the Colorado Plateau. Also like seeps and hanging gardens. The best populations I've seen are in Dominguez-Escalante Canyon, or excuse me, in Dominguez-Escalante NCA, specifically in Escalante Canyon, as well as along the Dolores River. It likes to grow in moist crevices perpendicular to the overhanging sandstone and canyon walls. And as far as red goes, it might be the reddest red I've seen in nature when it's in full regale. It's just a beautiful little flower. Again, showing locations that are generally relegated to the Four Corners region. So lastly, we'll talk about the threatened and endangered species they manage, of which there are 2. And BLM is mandated per the ESA to work towards the recovery and delisting of species protected under the Endangered Species Act. And because of that mandate, the 2 species I'm going to talk about next really do dominate a fair bit of my workload. So the first one to talk about is Sclerocactus glaucus, or the Colorado hookless cactus. It was first listed under the Endangered Species Act as a threatened species in 1979. And we have extensive occurrences in the Dominguez-Escalante and Gunnison Gorge NCA. Colorado hookless cactus is limited to the Gunnison and Colorado River basins and the tributary canyons in Delta, Montrose, Mesa, and Garfield counties. Pretty good map showing what we believe to be the range of the species in the lower right there. It largely occurs in small dispersed populations, averaging a couple hundred individual plants at any given site. We think seed dispersal is a limiting factor in species distribution. Unlike some of our other species we spoke about, this species exhibits a generalist habit, occupying a wide range of soil types with differing soil chemistry. So it does behave more like a generalist, but because of its relatively small aerial extent, we do still consider it a rare endemic. And plants are often found growing in unique sheltered microhabitats under and within canopy of shrubs, grasses, or what we consider nurse plants. And we're not sure if they're truly exploiting, a cooler microhabitat, or if that's generally where they avoid being kicked out of the ground by wildlife and domestic livestock. Unanswered questions. So what do we do for recovery actions? What do we mean when we say we're working on recovery of a species? So relative to the Sclerocactus glaucus, since 1979, the BLM has conducted extensive survey work. One big thing that really set us on the path of recovery was the designation of the NLCS units, specifically the wilderness areas, both in Dominguez-Escalante and Gunnison Gorge NCA. What could be more protective than wilderness designation? So that was a huge step forward. Additionally, in the last decade, the Grand Junction Field Office, the Uncompahgre Field Office, and the Colorado River Valley Field Office, all 3 offices manage this species, completed land use plans that now provide what we call regulatory assurance that the species will be protected into the future. The other things we've been working on is statistically robust monitoring program range-wide. Prior to 2011, there was no really coordinated monitoring effort. Many offices were doing different things, different ways, and so we could say nothing meaningful about population trends of the species. So In 2011, we banded together and put together a robust monitoring program range-wide. The other thing we did is we developed a statistically valid population estimate procedure. We were able to get this paper published last fall that presents a novel idea of estimating populations without very intensive sampling. The other thing BLM's been doing is funding conservation genetics research with the University of Northern Colorado. And Mitt McLaughlin and Sammy Nybar produced a report, a publication in 2021 that's also provided some very interesting results. And then further, we've developed programmatic conservation measures for grazing management. So what is all this telling us? When we look at our monitoring range wide, despite drought, we've been seeing the cactus on a generally steady population trend. Statistically, there's no change here, although it looks like visually there might be a minor downturn. But again, statistically, we can say that over the last decade, despite numerous droughts, this species population trend appears stable. Further, with our population estimate procedure, we were able to demonstrate that there were far more plants on the landscape than previously thought. In 2009, when the Fish and Wildlife Service did their species status assessment, they concluded an estimated 20,000 plants were present on the landscape. Well, using our standard protocols and our robust sample design and our novel population estimate procedure, we were able to demonstrate that there are an estimated 68 to 138,000 plants with 90% confidence throughout the range of the species. So we demonstrated that there's almost 3.5 times more plants on the low end of the population estimate than previous assumptions. Our genetic research also found some very intriguing things. We demonstrated that there are no issues with gene flow amongst the populations. In other words, no individual population is becoming genetically isolated or subject to stochastic events. That same research showed something that we never ever dreamed, which was that the plants in the Greater Grand Valley were genetically distinct enough from the plants that occur up in the Debec area north of Plateau Creek. And so that same research is now suggesting a split of what was formerly Sclerocactus glaucus into 2 distinct species, and the new population or the new species Sclerocactus dawsonii is the stuff that is occurring in and around the Debec area. So things you didn't ever expect when you develop your hypothesis. So what does all this concerted effort mean? Well, the Fish and Wildlife Service, through all the data provided from BLM, has determined that Sclerocactus glaucus and even more surprisingly, Sclerocactus dawsonii are no longer warranted for protection under the ESA. That's a huge win. Been at this a long time, and I've never been a part of seeing anything come off the endangered species list. Currently, we're helping the Fish and Wildlife Service on a delisting plan that is expected to be published in mid to late 2022, and we're expecting a final delisting decision sometime in 2023. So a real win for both conservation and how the Endangered Species Act is supposed to work. So lastly, we'll talk about Eriogonum polynophilum, or clay-loving wild buckwheat. This is the only permanent resident endangered species that occurs in Western Colorado. It was listed as an endangered species under the ESA in 1984. It's only known to occur in the Gunnison Gorge NCA and a few small areas to the east of Montrose. It's a very long-lived perennial shrub that only grows on the Mancos Shale. The habitat is so inhospitable that only the most adapted species are able to survive. The soils that this plant occurs on are very heavy clay soils. And as a result, clay soils are slow to uptake water. And even worse, the clays are even slower to release the water back to the plants. So it's a very harsh environment. The way this species exploits its habitat is it occupies microhabitats that are typically on east and north facing gentle slopes or swales where snow drifts and accumulates additional moisture. Much of the habitat and population loss likely occurred with the development of farming following the Gunnison Tunnel project. And today, motorized recreation and development are persistent threats. So some of the recovery actions we're working on, again, extensive survey work since 1984. Surprisingly, most of the populations that we now know about have been discovered since about 2007. Again, the Gunnison Gorge National Conservation Area designation, as well as the land use plan and some of the protections afforded under that land use plan have greatly helped preserve this species. We've also developed statistically robust monitoring program range-wide. Again, prior to 2011, there were different techniques being used that really we could say nothing meaningful range-wide. Again, because of the threat from OHV impacts, we've been developing a number of fence exclosures around at-risk populations. That's kind of what the photos to the right are trying to display. We're also working on conservation genetics research, again, with the Northern Colorado Genetics Lab. And also we've got programmatic conservation measures for grazing management in place. Unfortunately, drought has been majorly adversely affecting this species throughout its range. So the figure on the top left here, the power line population occurs in the northern end of the population range. And pretty much since the advent of the drought in 2017, we've been seeing statistically significant population declines. That's particularly concerning because populations in the northern end of the range are typically small, only a few hundred plants. The Model Airplane Club site is in the middle portion of the range of the species, and we're seeing similar but potentially larger population declines of the species. As you move south, you go up in elevation, and so you get greater precip, and so it is concerning that we're seeing similar population declines as in the northern drier portion of the range. But even more concerning is the southern population, the South Fairview area, which is directly east of Montrose. We're seeing even greater population declines. And so areas that we thought were more resilient to things like drought in the southern portion of the range are actually showing greater impacts from drought. So again, the last 5 years, drought has been particularly hard on these populations. As a result, we wanted to try to make some forecasts of what we think could be going on. So we used linear modeling or statistical modeling to attribute climatic variables and try to determine what's driving population trends. As a result, we're understanding that fall and winter precipitation are very critical. As I said, this species occurs on heavy clay soils. And so, and that those soils are very slow to uptake water. So why would fall and winter precipitation be very critical? Those storms tend to come in cooler periods of the year. They tend to come in longer duration, low intensity events, and as snow that slowly melts and is absorbed in the soil profile. We've also come to understand that spring temperatures are also very important. Spring is when the species is most actively growing, putting on new leaves, developing flowers, trying to reproduce. So concerning things about what we understand currently in our modeling efforts is that under climate warming scenarios, things don't look terribly good for this species. So the figure in the lower right is depicting that as you get increasing fall precipitation, with cooler temperatures, we can expect population trends to increase. However, with our climate warming predictions, an average spring temperature of 51 degrees may negate increased precipitation and result in declining population trends. So some current concerning things that we're continuing to work on, improve our models and our forecasting, try to understand better what we can expect as we move forward. Lastly, we've been working on refining a high resolution habitat suitability model. With so few populations, we think that there's indeed more, and we know there's more. We're finding more plants populations every year. We've been able to utilize some very high resolution LiDAR data, as well as 1 to 24,000 scale mapping of the Mancus Shale, which has differentiated the Smoky Hill member, which is strongly correlated to this species occurrence. This has given us the ability to model biologically relevant variables for the species. As we said, it likes to exploit, small microhabitats of gentle slopes and north and east facing aspects where snow accumulates. Well, 1 meter resolution LiDAR data can help us discern where on the landscape those sorts of habitats occur. The map on the right shows what we thought was a good habitat model prior to doing this high resolution effort. And basically it tells you that anywhere on the Mancus Shale, as indicated by all the red, that you can have a chance of finding the species. That's not very good because you can see we've got individual plants and they just simply don't occur that well. So the results of our new model are just remarkable in our ability to predict habitat suitability. So again, using this high resolution data, we've taken a model that we used to have to spend days maybe wandering around in the desert trying to find this plant. So now we can really refine, we've really refined where we can expect to find this species. In fact, we're getting predictions of 94% or better. And this map on the right is showing the Bureau of Reclamation is planning to pipe this ditch that you can kind of see traversing the map. And so they hired a consultant to do surveys for Eriogonum pelanophilum. And these blue polygons are places that we didn't have any information on that we now have buckwheat presence. And so we used our new model, and it's just simply remarkable at how well the hot red spots are showing up and where we're finding plants. So we're looking forward to using this as a tool to help us potentially put more populations on the map, and also to look in places that we had not previously looked. And the result should be less effort for potentially many more populations. So a lot of this work is done with partners. So I just want to acknowledge a lot of the folks that help us get this done, specifically the BLM Colorado State Office. Carol Dawson, our state botanist, is a pretty phenomenal lady. She supports us wholly in all this work. And her sidekick, Phil Krenning, Colorado Natural Heritage Program, which tends to be our clearinghouse for all these rare and endemic species. They keep a lot of the GIS data, locations in what we call elements occurrences. The Colorado Natural Areas Program, which helps us with a ton of monitoring. Again, the University of Northern Colorado, the Denver Botanic Gardens, and perhaps most importantly, the many, many volunteers and technicians that help with inventory monitoring and resource protection. And with that, thanks so much for listening, and have some time for questions, hopefully.
Well, thank you, Ken. This is a cool rundown of some plants. Sorry, I'm just trying to get my windows arranged. Everyone, please feel free to put some questions in the chat or the Q&A box. We do have one question so far. Can you just talk more about the Endangered Species Act, Ken? You mentioned at the beginning with some of those species that weren't listed already, wanting to do work to prevent the ESA from getting kind of pulled into the, to your work. So the question is, why does BLM not want involvement of Endangered Species Act? But, can you speak more to that?
Certainly. Give a little bit of feedback there. Do you hear that? Well, the reason we don't want it to see a species go on the Endangered Species Act is the bottom line, it costs a lot of money. If you did a dollar-to-dollar figure on what we spend managing the hookless cactus or the clay-loving buckwheat, it's orders of magnitude greater than the BLM sensitive species. As a biologist, it's a pride thing for me. The last thing I want is a species to become threatened with becoming endangered, or worse yet, becoming endangered of going extinct, which are what the Endangered Species Act is supposed to do. And also, the Endangered Species Act comes with a lot of challenges. Environmental groups do try to weaponize it against traditional land use practices like recreation, like livestock grazing. And so it comes with a lot of, litigation threats and a whole lot of work that if we can avoid the Endangered Species Act, but manage to conserve those species, it saves the taxpayers, it saves the traditional land use efforts as well. So, and again, I go back to, as a biologist, it's a pride thing for me. I don't want to see species going extinct.
Great. We have a couple questions about if folks are out hiking and they see any of these plants, is there a way for them to report them?
You bet. I did put my email address and phone number. We'd love to know where some of these species are. If you could give us a rough coordinate, sketch out a map on a napkin, we'll take whatever you can get, but we're always interested in new information. If you can't remember or you don't catch my email, Google BLM Montrose and you should be able to find my name and phone number there.
Great. Okay, another question. Has your model been available to other BLM offices for other areas, like where you would find Phacelia submutica or parachute penstemon?
I can maybe guess who's asking this question. My sidekick, Anna Lincoln, who's the ecologist at the Grand Junction Field Office, we're working on developing similar models, not so much for submutica. We got some challenges there on the fine scale that geospatially we're not there yet. But certainly the parachute penstemon, a couple other species that Anna has a lot of interest in that occur more in that Book Cliffs area. We're working on similar modeling approaches. The real limitation, though, is the data sets that can operate at the fine scales that these narrow niche species, live and behave in. LiDAR data is very expensive and it's not available everywhere. So that's, a classic limitation. Fine scale geologic mapping is also a challenge.
Great. Well, everyone, I put Ken's email address in the chat. If you do see plants that you'd like to send him a report of. let's see. Next question. Thank you to Ken and CCA. Is anybody propagating any of these plants for reintroduction? And then a second question, is there any evidence of vandalism at any of the exclosure sites?
Okay, so propagation, really not a lot. The Denver Botanic Gardens had dabbled a little bit in the late 90s with propagating Colorado hookless cactus. Mixed results. The BLM sensitive species were not to a level of concern. They're secure enough that we're not really interested in propagating them. Nature's doing a fine job. So yeah, I guess that hopefully that closely answers that question. Vandalism, that's a funny one. Yes, vandalism happens. So I acknowledge my volunteers. I have a lovely couple of volunteers that make monthly visits to these exclosures, and they let me know immediately when vandalism happens. What we found is people, when those structures are new, they don't agree with them, they don't like them, they don't like the routes that potentially they used to walk their dog on being closed. And so early on, we had massive amounts of vandalism, sometimes 2-3 times a month. I don't know whether those people gave up because I would go charging out there and fix repair the fences immediately, or if they moved on. But some of these exclosures have been in place for a decade now, and we have no damage. In fact, my lovely volunteers tell me how bored they are. They don't get to report all the crazy things they used to see. So it's a battle of attrition, and maybe I'm winning.
Well, that's great. It looks like we have a few folks who are interested in helping you in any way possible. So we have a question of how can we become involved in volunteering to find these plants, as well as someone wondering if they could get a list of plants with pictures that you're looking for specifically in McInnes Canyon. So do you rely on volunteers for finding plants?
Not so much in recent years. We used to have quite a few volunteers that were interested in that. That being said, I'll never turn down somebody who's willing to give us a hand. You've got my contact information. Please reach out. We'll discuss how you can fit in, and we'll find a place for you. Sorry, Annie, repeat the second part.
Yeah, I think this was just another person who was interested in whether you had a list of plants with the pictures that they would be able to find specifically in McInnes if they were to be out hiking.
Oh, yeah. We do. You could Google the Colorado Natural Heritage Program. They have a pretty good list of all these species and where they occur in the BLM management units. If that doesn't get you, either myself or Anna Lincoln would be glad to, get you some of the field books, I guess, for lack of a better term, field guides we use. And we could get you, images and habitat descriptions of some of these species, and be glad to get you that information and look forward to working with you. So again, please reach out.
Awesome. Well, folks, send more questions in. Okay, here's one more. We do a lot of work with various land management agencies on sage grouse and work with them on building structures and improving habitat. I was curious if you have any projects with other partners for habitat restoration for these species.
Habitat restoration for these species is really difficult. These are being very, unique desert habitats. They don't have a lot of resilience to disturbance, and the resistance to invasive species is also a challenge. So I wish it were as easy to just, place a few well-placed rocks and sort of change the environment. We're dealing with some big, very challenging landscape level issues. Colorado hook-nose cactus is maybe my best example. A lot of places, particularly in and around the Grand Junction area, are really dominated by invasive grasses, cheatgrass or annual wheatgrass. And it's very challenging. We're dealing with soil chemistry changes, soil biotic health that's changed from what it was. And so difficult. That's also something I work on a fair bit, is ecological restoration. And I hope to get there someday. Similarly, clay loving buckwheat, there is no restoration. Those soils, those habitats are so delicate. It's such a harsh environment that once it's disturbed, we're talking, I think, geologic time to fix the problem. Unfortunately, many of the other species we had talked about, we're not seeing the same types of, habitat degradation that those other two species. So that's a good thing.
Well, it sounds like you will be getting an email or two from some of those interested volunteers. So I'm
take
so
free labor.
Yeah, so glad this is an opportunity for some more folks to get involved. You're getting big congratulations from Dave Kaufman and Karen Tucker, who are very proud of you and your great work, and are super excited by the modeling tying the specific members of the Mancos Shale Formation. So a lot of congratulations in the chat, and thanks to you for a very informative presentation. We do have some time for more questions if anybody else has any. I was curious, Ken, I remember when we were out and you were showing me some of those plants and you mentioned it with one of the species. Why selenium? Why do some plants tend to concentrate selenium?
Well, it's an evolutionary advantage, right? Selenium in high concentrations is toxic to most living things. So it's an open niche, but also those plants, for whatever reason, survived exploiting more selenium, probably because they're not tasty, they're poisonous. And so again, it's just that narrow niche exploitation.
Okay. Well, we'll wait a minute and see if anyone has additional questions. But that was very informative, and I think everyone seemed to really enjoy it. I think, yeah, we had a lot of interest in this lecture. This is recorded and it'll be sent out to everyone who's here tonight and those who couldn't make it tonight to be able to watch this recording. This is our last lecture for this spring, but stay tuned. We will be announcing future lectures, probably picking it back up in the fall again when we're kind of at that shoulder season of it's getting a little cold to be outside or wet. And so we can do these evening virtual lectures. Looks like we have one more question. I may have missed it, but isn't there a native flower that is indicative of high selenium soil?
I would say there are many. Perhaps the one the questioner was thinking of is what we call princess plume. It is very much a high selenium soil species. You see it early in the spring, beautiful yellow flowers, kind of a tall, grayish, leathery looking leaf structure. That is one that I would say is pretty ubiquitous and indicative of high selenium. But, as we showed, there's several others that do exploit high selenium, like the San Rafael milkvetch. Others that come to mind aren't readily available, but I know there are several other species.
Okay. Well, you're getting a lot of thanks. Really appreciate you showing up and doing this presentation and rescheduling it. I'm so glad you got your voice back.
Yep. Good. I
Thanks, everyone.
appreciate everybody tuning in. It's always tough to decide how much is too much information. So it sounds like it was just about right. So thanks, everybody.
I think so. Yeah, well, thanks for tuning in, everyone. And if we don't have any more questions, I think we'll let you go. It's still a really nice evening. So
Great. Thanks all. Have a good evening.
thanks, Ken.
See you, Annie. Bye-bye.